always end up at Tesla somehow.
We've been there now a couple of sessions, like with Mikael, we talked about this also. Actually, of course, the after work always continues after the show is off. And I'm sorry, guys, the best discussions were actually at 9 o'clock. My wife was killing me because I was supposed to be home at 9. But we talked about this, and we also talk about this first principle is something that came up. And we had a much better conversation about what first principle is if we talk about it from a business sort of, what's your first principle as a business, what your core idea of value is. And when we actually relate it back to the engineering perspective of first principle.
Do you have any view of what does a first principle mean for you?
Well, Marshall McLuhan wrote a very interesting book in the 60s called Understanding Media. And in the preface of that book, he mentions IBM. And this is like, I think it is, it's middle 60s. And he writes, when IBM understood it was in the business of processing information, it had its course set. And now it seems self-evident. But I think for him to spot that in the 60s, that it's about information processing, was very astute. And I think that is sort of one way of formulating a first principle. Like we're in the business of information here, guys. That's what we do. And
this was Klingvall's angle. You have exactly the same understanding of first principle as Mikael Klingvall, who's a data scientist. And
so something about sticking to the vision, so to speak, and having the right vision from the start in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's sort of, we spoke about philosophy earlier, and I find it very interesting. And, the Greeks had that know thyself motto, and the British Romanticists sort of embraced that. But I think that urge, or not the urge, but that the endeavor of knowing yourself, that reflective effort, I think, is very valuable. And when companies do that properly, you can have this self-understanding of your business and what your value is to really play an important role in how you then make money off your business. But if you don't understand what you're doing, then you may sort of self-identify with something that then doesn't have sustainability over time. So think of Volvo, for instance. Volvo is no longer a Swedish company, but they retain that tail made by Sweden, right? And then I remember I was in this panel discussion with a senior person from Volvo, and she was saying that, at Volvo we're working with this. We're trying to embrace the idea that we may not be working with selling cars anymore. And that's a tough swallow for a lot of people. But today I saw that Volvo has this idea of by, I forget, 2030 or something, they will have 50% of their cars on subscription. So half of the fleet, half of the cars out there that are Volvo cars aren't sold cars. So what is your business? Do you sell cars? Well, no, you don't. So what do you do? And then if you just reflect upon what you actually do, then you will sort of be able to do that thing. You will stick to the first principle, but it will look differently over time depending on, market dynamics and other things.
But Anders, I really want to have your engineering point of view on first principle, because I think this is really vital as well in this kind of innovation
it would have been fun to hear you reflect on, if you take the first principle approach, but from a technology point of view instead of a business point of view. And just see if you apply that for IBM, would that be appropriate or not? Or Volvo, I really like what you said about changing, instead of selling cars or even selling a service, you actually sell a function. And this is the circular economy kind of thinking that perhaps is changing the first principle in some way. But from a technology point of view, and going back to Elon perhaps, and thinking Tesla or thinking SpaceX or SolarCity, I think SpaceX perhaps is the best explanation for it. And they want to build rockets, and then they look at, how does it work today? And then you can say, okay, let's do like other people do, and just to try to improve the process a bit. Or you go to the core physical principles of how rockets work and rethink, is this really the right way to do it? Is it really right to build a rocket and then just throw it away when you use it once? Or can you actually land it again and try to have it, being reused, and in that way reduce the cost significantly? And then just thinking that through, going back to the original part, how do you actually build this? What are the physical laws making a rocket work? and why can't you land it? And just, really question the normality, the normal way of doing things, and instead of thinking about, how does it really work? And I guess that's why Elon at least thinks about first principles as well as I understand it, at least. What's your thought about that from a technology point of view?
It certainly makes sense, and I think that would, if we were so inclined, invite us to discuss quantum computing, right? Because quantum is a completely different way of attacking computation, and it's much more closer to the perhaps bedrock, if there is such a thing, of reality, right? You start with the atoms and you say, okay, how are they behaving? Where are they behaving? Like, can we manipulate them? And then what will come out of that? So it certainly makes sense to me to always question, what is the first principle, or what's the are you familiar with biomimicry?
No, not really.
It's like this discipline of trying to stand up nature-like or biology-like approaches to problems. And there's a lot of interesting benefit from that, because in nature you will see biological processes performing very well, but at a much lower energy consumption. So if we were to think of say the human brain, right? And if you want to stand up a technology equivalent of the human brain today with the computational means available, probably the energy consumption would be rather large, and it would just not simply be possible. So you have to find another way, but apparently there is another way, because nature has another way. It doesn't work through combustion engines or electricity. It has, it does different things for different purposes, and it's sort of a low energy, clever approach to things, and it has perfected its method over millennia through the process of evolution, natural selection, and what else comes to play. And I think so biomimicry is this idea to try and sort of understand nature more closely and then mimic it.
I really like the idea of being, questioning and having critical mindset and really thinking, why do we need to do it this way?
Right.
And the better understanding you have of the core principles, I think the easier it is to question, why something is done in a certain way, right?
Right. And it's very easy to sort of fall back to anthropomorphic approaches, right? And we think about, we need to stand up robots that look like humans, but really, if you want to automate the washing of the dishes, you don't create a humanoid robot that does the dishes and using hands or stuff like that. You invent the washing machine, and that's done, right? Or as the French poet Apollinaire said, when man wanted to invent a faster way of moving, it created the wheel. It didn't sort of add more legs or bigger legs or stronger legs. It just legs. What about the wheel? The wheel's a good thing, and then boom, and we have bicycles and cars.
And I read somewhere quite recently this quite interesting example of this. Like, you put man on a map of who is using the least amount of energy while they're traveling 1 kilometer. And then you have much more efficient animals in the animal kingdom. So we are quite mediocre in terms of how much energy we use to travel 1 kilometer. But just to make the whole point of first principle or rethinking or innovation, when they did the calculation, then they put the man riding a bicycle doing 1 kilometer. And of course, the man on the bicycle blows all the animals out of the water in terms of energy efficiency. So it's a very simple telling example of what we are talking about here.
Absolutely. And I think every child who gets on a bike will just be enamored and just seduced by what happens when you pedal, because you seem to get more out of it than you put in.
And this is also then, we are able to use tools to rethink the fundamentals of what we're trying to do.